Welcome again. Today is June 19th, and we are on the Taos Institute webinar series on relational leading. Today, our guests are Diana Whitney and Frank Barrett, and they will be talking about, they will be having an improvisational dialogue about appreciative inquiry and relational leading. And I just wanted to mention a little bit about the Taos Institute. The Taos Institute is a nonprofit educational organization, and we bring scholars and practitioners together to explore theories and practices around social construction, appreciative and relational theories.
Diana, how about we start with you, and let's kick off the conversation with what's the relationship between relational leading and appreciative inquiry? And how would you set the context for relational leading? Thank you.
Okay. So the question of the relationship between relational leading and appreciative inquiry is certainly an important one. And I would consider appreciative inquiry one of the practice sets, one of the processes that really is important for relational leading. That relational leading is for me, a series of practices. Dawn, there's a slide that shows 3 different: leadership, leading, and leader. Can we put that slide on just briefly? So when we look at this, there have been many ways that leader and leadership has been thought of over the years. Much of the literature and the narratives are about the leader, the person in the position. And I'm not denying that there are people who have jobs as leaders. But when we, as practitioners, focus on them and their individual traits or their strengths, we miss a lot of capacity for collaboration. So appreciative inquiry is one of those collaborative processes that allows for, we could call it co-leading, relational leading, people going forward together, doing things and communicating together, determining what it is they want to accomplish, and then accomplishing it collaboratively. Frank, you want to add anything to that?
Yeah, I think that's great. I like especially your emphasis on sets of practices, that relational leading is a set of practice points, as well as appreciative inquiry. I really like that point, and I'll come back to it in a few minutes.
Great.
Because it takes it outside of the heroic individual. I think that's a really
exactly. It takes it outside of the heroic individual, which not only is individualistic, but so much of it is also, just to say it, has a gender bias, and it has cultural biases. Yeah. And so when we move into these collaborative processes and practices, we're really allowing people to get to know each other and be able to come together in ways that kind of work better for everybody involved. So, yeah, go ahead.
I have an example. I have a quick example that will make this point. It's research by Boris Groysberg, a professor at Harvard. He was studying Wall Street investment firms that hired these superstars, right? So there were these superstars, these individual great performers, and there was other firms tried to raid those firms to get the great performers. And when the great performers showed up in the new cultures, their performance declined.
Interesting. That is a great example. Dawn, pop to the next slide, and let me build on what Frank is saying. So after, excuse me, a couple of years of using appreciative inquiry at Hunter Douglas, Amanda Trostin Bloom and I went back and did a bit of research in the organization about why did appreciative inquiry work. We were looking for people's stories, their narratives. Well, what did they say? Now, we put this phrase, the freedom, in front of it. But what people talked about is that appreciative inquiry let them get to know each other and be known in a relational context. And for them, that was really different than, I have a job, it's my role, these are my responsibilities. And they valued what appreciative inquiry enabled them to do in terms of strengthening relatedness. The second thing is people talked about being heard. And again, so much of the practice and so much of the literature is you should be a good listener. An individual should be a good listener. But it seems that appreciative inquiry is a process that really creates an environment where people can be heard. So I have here versus the ancient rhetorical view of a good man speaking well that privileges talking over listening, or, as appreciative inquiry does, letting people feel heard and be heard. The other thing that we found, which again is a huge shift in the literature on leadership, is people said they got to dream in community and they got to share their dreams. One of the women had a dream to simply see where her work went. Her work went to South America. Her dream was to go and meet the people who used her work. Her vision wasn't for the whole company. Her vision wasn't for the whole department. It was a vision to make her work better. And when she was able to do that, there were resources and she got sent to South America. So the old model is the leader has a vision and the leader has to figure out how to roll it out. Appreciative inquiry says everybody's got generative possibilities. Everybody has dreams. And if we come together in community, we can enliven them and share them. The following one is the choosing to contribute. It really led us to say, you know what, everybody's a volunteer all the time. And I think this ties a lot into improvisation, Frank, because the old models are you assign it to somebody or someone, you get an assignment, you get measured, you get evaluated about whether you do the assignment. And I think both being a volunteer and improvisation really allow people to move when the spirit calls them. You want to build on that one there, Frank?
No, this is good. I'll come back to that.
Okay, perfect. Then we move into one that says people found appreciative inquiry enables them to act with support. They're not told, be empowered, go do it. But they're, again, in a community that understands each other, has built some shared realities, and they can act but feel supported, either by peer groups, by people at different levels in the hierarchy. And then the final one, which surprised the heck out of us, people talked about how important it was for them that appreciative inquiry gave them permission to be positive. Because the prior norm was, in order to be smart, you've got to critique. And so this is a set of understandings that can lead to practices and processes that are absolutely, I think, essentially linked to relational leading. Yeah. So why don't you have a say for a while, Frank? I can certainly come back and talk more.
Sure. Great. I'm just nodding because there's so many linkages here with you know, the whole notion of improvisation and what you call relational leading. I've been calling it distributed leadership. So I'll just say a few things about it just to set the context. If you think about some of the major movements in the world today, they're without leaders. I mean, Wikipedia is a great example of sort of a spontaneous, leaderless, non-hierarchical movement. And the Occupy Wall Street movement, the Arab Spring, you know, and some organizations have even taken this leaderless capacity and made it a real strength for, I mean, just the whole notion of crowdsourcing or crowdfunding, just letting loose and inviting. I like the way you repeat the word freedom because it's this incredible open sourceness which is really a challenge to all the theories in social science that say that organizations have to be more bureaucratic in order to sustain. So our practices have gone beyond that. And so if we look at those things, we have to ask ourselves, like, what are the qualities in those movements? What's happening that's allowing that kind of organization to form, that kind of distributed leadership? And again, I love the pulse of the word freedom you used repeatedly. Maybe, Dawn, could you go to my first slide on provocative competence? So yeah, the notions, one of the chapters in my book is called Provocative Competence, is sort of a skill that I'll call it leaderly activity. I'm trying to get out of the framework of individual heroes. I mean, I think if a Martian landed in an airport bookstore, he would think that Steve Jobs is a god, or Bill Gates or Jack Welch. It depends. We put all this emphasis on these individual heroes. But I like what you're saying around leadership practices, and I'm trying to I'm playing with the right way to word it. And I've been calling it distributed leading. But these three movements, I think, that encourage distributed leading that invites improvisation. One is more an emphasis on continuous change, on emergence, rather than episodic change. I mean, all of our theories about what change, including Kurt Lewin, assumes that change is an interruption. It's a radical different state. It's a discontinuous state. It goes from A to B. And so many of our theories have planned to change as if it's introducing something radically new. But I think distributed leadership emphasizes continuous change, continuous and incremental emergence. And having an awareness of that is important. The second, sort of an emphasis on design rather than decision-making. So the decision-making model, I think, reinforces what you just said is a gender bias, culture bias, emphasis on individuals. So we even teach this in business schools, rational decision-making, strategic planning based on this deductive, model of, market analysis, as if, decision-making is a moment in time. You make a decision that's going to set a new course, as opposed to a notion of design. And the work that's been done at IDEO, but design thinking, and I think we shouldn't call it design thinking. We should call it design doing or design activity. The continual proposal of probes, ongoing probes and experimentation as a way to move into a future, so that then you look back and see what you did, so you can look back then and articulate what your movement was, rather than decide it in advance in the sort of the bureaucratic fashion. It's sort of a mindset of discovery, and I think if I was going to add one bullet to your slide, I'd say freedom to discover.
There you go.
And the last is what I won't say any more about, because you just nailed it, is the emphasis on strength and appreciation over deficit-based theories of development. That with those sort of three subtle moves, I think that's what allows distributed leading to happen. And distributed leading invites improvisation, improvisation and freedom. So that's where I see an overlap.
Yeah, I think, Frank, of course, all of this makes sense to me. The piece that I think is absolutely essential is changing our view of change.
Right.
Because I don't think it was ever a functional view. I mean, nothing about life stops and then becomes something else. Children grow gradually. Relationships build over time. Yeah. Organizations move strategically in relation to markets and environments. Excuse me.
Yeah.
So that notion of understanding that change is happening and that dialogue, so that's where I would add a bullet to yours, dialogue and reflection about what is. enables the inquiry, the probing, and the design.
Yeah, absolutely.
And at any moment, if we're designing, we're being present.
Mm-hmm.
Decision-making kind of looks back at what happened and tries to make a future. I think design dialogue keeps us present. So I like this very much.
Yeah, yeah, totally. And I like something you said in passing. I want to come back to, and you said the freedom to know and be known. Mm-hmm. That's really important, because that's the issue of identity, right? I mean, that's identity creation stuff, and we operate out of some sense of what our identity is, or try to enhance our identity through activity. And it's amazing how much we depend on other people to have an identity. We think, again, the bias, the rational modernist bias, is that identity is this individual monad, but it's extremely relational, and we totally depend on one another in order to act into we anticipate what the world's going to look like, act into it, discover as we go, create as we go, because of narratives of identity. And that's what I like about what you said, the freedom to know and be known, unleashing repertoires of possibility.
Yes.
That people can act into. You see, in a way, what you're talking about is expanding the imaginative repertoire of possibility. And that's totally relational.
Totally relational. And with that, Frank, comes the need to understand that we live in language communities, we live in narrative communities, and that our identity is in some ways made and imagined in the language and the stories of the people with whom we interact. And so that sort of identity is embedded in our relatedness. And whether people are in positions as leaders or whether they are a community wanting to accomplish something, I think the questions of identity are essential. One of the things I've always said when I've worked with a large-scale change process, I've said to managers, realize the minute you think you want to change something, you are mucking with people's identity.
Yeah, that's absolutely right.
Or I could say it more gently, but that's how it feels.
I wonder what, I'm just thinking, imagining 20 years from now, what new vocabulary would we like to see out in the world? So when people tell stories about their identity, it's a different narrative than the one we're telling now. I see it changing a little bit. I already see it changing from what was 20, 25 years ago, but I wonder what it'll look like in 20 or 25 years. I'm imagining there'll be some other great breakthrough, another Apple-like organization, but I don't want to see Steve Jobs' picture on the book.
Thank you very much. I have to tell you, I stopped reading a well-regarded person's new book, not anyone in our Taos community, because
thank you. I immediately felt bad.
No, you shouldn't. I love your book. But in the first chapter, there were 20 citations, all of men, and there were no women's voices referred to. Mm-hmm. And I just said, you know what? I'm not going to read it. I'm just not going to read it, because if that person can't make the move to some kind of gender collaboration and respect, then I can't be promoting that work. So we also have to talk a little bit about the power dynamics in all this. When you wonder about language, I think that's so important. We know, I think speaking in plural, is helpful. I think.
Yeah, and by the way, and I like your phrase, leadership practices, by the way. I'm making a note about that. I plan to use it. I'll cite you, of course, but I like that. That's one example. But go ahead, what else? Plural, you're saying.
Yeah, and where I am right now, Frank, is I feel like those of us who think about these things, have to make some bold experiments with diverse groups of people to create language that works.
Yeah.
You know, I had a remarkable man in one of my leadership programs, and when we started talking about social constructionism, he's from South Africa, he said, I understand this because we say we created Mandela.
Mm-hmm.
We don't say what he did for the country, we say we created him.
That's good. That's good.
Now, isn't that an interesting way of thinking about it?
That's interesting. The arrow goes the other way.
Yeah.
I like that.
The identity arrow, maybe.
Yeah, yeah, I like that. I like that. Yeah, that.
So I think that there are some, again, some things we can learn from different cultures. Because here's another place that I'm profoundly curious these days, Frank. My colleagues in Japan, if you are on this call, hello, their challenges are very different. Their challenges are how do we come out of a collective identity to have individual proactivity, free will, expression. Because they're a culture that is, their conversation and relational realities are to defer to the collective.
Right. Right. And that might inhibit freedom. Is that what you're saying? Yeah, yeah, yeah. Interesting.
And it makes folks have to leave to feel like they can be part of a bigger community.
Yeah.
When they want to stay and find a way to have a unique voice. I mean, so we're playing with this self-identity in relation.
Yeah.
Which is why this program is so important.
Yeah, totally. Yeah, so I think, go ahead.
I was going to say, you have some things to say about that from your improv.
I could, yeah. I was just, but you got me thinking in another direction here.
Yeah.
But yeah, let me get out some of these things on improvisation. Dawn, could you go to the next slide? I'll just touch on, I don't want to talk through all these bullets, so I'll just mention a few of them that would because I'm thinking about this. What's a new vocabulary that's going to appreciate relational dynamics? I love what you said. Is we created Mandela, and because also
it's your number 6. I talk about your number 6 all the time. There's a piece of vocabulary. There's a skill set we all need to learn.
Yeah, yeah, exactly. Because we also create heroic images like Steve Jobs. Well, actually, I'm sorry to take on Steve Jobs so much. I'll change it to, it used to be Edison. When Thomas Edison died, he was hailed as a genius, but he didn't invent those things. He brought together a group of people, who were tinkering, and if he invented anything, it was a publicity machine. But we create these images of heroes, and so I like that. I mean, we created Mandela. Well, so the language I've been playing with is around jazz improvisation, because I think they do have a vocabulary for relational creativity, and that's the way they see the world. I mean, and identity is always at stake. I'm just making this link now that we're talking. I never realized it till this moment how much identity is always on edge in jazz performances. At any moment, you could go down the tubes, or you could be heightened, in ways that surprise you all the time, and it's always dependent on your surroundings. It's always up for grabs. So anyway, I'll say a few of these. We've talked about, I've talked earlier about trap of success in several different contexts. I'll just say a few things about that. That routines, we need routines, but they also get in the way. What makes improvisation or jazz improvisation an attractive metaphor is, this notion of being suspicious of routines that are too automatic. And again, I think if we over-rely on routines, we're inhibiting our freedom. Come back to your phrase. So I'll say something about the third point here, because it's just to bring in a whole different construct here. total freedom is not possible. So it's not like total, that's chaos, right? There are constraints in jazz and in organizing. And that is, there's this what I call minimal structure or minimal consensus. There has to be some agreement on just the right amount of things, just the right things. And, you know, too much agreement is destructive to freedom, to creativity and improvisation. You don't have to agree about everything, but just the right things that unleashes possibility, but also constrains. You know, there's a rhythm that, you know, that every now and then you come back together, you pulsate as a group and coordinate. That's what allows coordination to happen. In jazz, it's the structure of a song, but in organizations, it's other things as well. So, you know, mottos and whatnot. I mean, I think of places. Go ahead.
I like that a lot, Frank, because what you're doing there again is giving us the balance between autonomy, whatever a person, a performer, a group has to contribute within the context of some structure and consensus.
Yeah.
I think that's really important.
Yeah, if we left to our own devices, I'll tell a story about the U.S. Navy in a minute. Left to our own devices, we drive out improvisation, creativity, innovation, usually out of fear, right? Because we're afraid it'll go off the reservation somehow. I'll tell you one quick story about this. The most bureaucratic community in the U.S. Navy is the submarine force. They're very procedural oriented, they're very bureaucratic, and they need to be because they have a nuclear power on the back of the boat. So you want them to be procedural oriented, right?
Right.
The nuclear power plant out, you know, underneath the water there, and you know they can't see, they don't know where they are, they have to orient themselves. They're very procedural. So here's what happened. They decided to try to redesign the control room of the boat. And how did they do it? They used the enlisted and junior officers to come together and brainstorm how it should be done. And several of the senior people did not want them to do it, thought that's crazy, they haven't had enough experience, they don't know how we do things. But they bounded it, and this is what I mean by minimal structure. They bounded this activity. They said from day 1 to day 3, you can be as creative as you want, just go, you know, off the wall. And then on day 4, you come back to your life. Well, they did it. They totally redesigned the ship, went back to their life, and many of their ideas are now going to be put into the next generation of submarines. If the Navy can do it, anybody can do it. So that was an example of distributed leadership.
That's a great example, and that's really important because I think one of the mistakes with all the excuse me, total quality stuff is that people, they don't want to be in charge of the whole company.
Right.
They want to have say within the limited bounds of their job, their capability, their interests, their strengths. People want that kind of boundary.
Yes.
And our processes have to balance the authority, hierarchy, and the freedom within.
Right.
A limited boundary. Because I chuckled when you earlier said a lot of organizations are adapting these processes. So then my question is, well, who is it that has the authority to adapt the processes? So we're always balancing authority and that freedom. And I think the jazz gets right at it.
Yeah, and so I had this, it's like an organizational jam session. It's a timeout. And I like what you said. It's within your context, and, you know, possibly it's going to bleed over into other contexts, but if you bound these activities, it doesn't mean you're going to destroy the soul of the organization or with the structure or the order. It's just, so anyway, I'll stop there because I can see Sally House trying to get in.
Well, I'm jumping in as the structure for this improvised conversation, and I want to say thank you to the two of you because I think the example that you gave of the Navy, Frank, and how you were speaking about the issue, Diana, towards the end of what I call improvised structures and structured improvisations. is really critical to some of the discussions that was coming up, which is around command and control, which is how do you do relational practices, or how do you shift the culture of command and control. So that example that you gave, Frank, was really remarkable, because I think having worked in disaster management, where command and control is the way to go, my position came in as a mental health leader. I was positioned in Katrina, and the examples you gave were very similar, that we had to work within that structure, but within that you improvise. Within that you create a participatory process. So I appreciated the dialogue, and I'm wondering, Jeannie, what kinds of questions stood out for you, for Frank and Diana, that you want to throw out?
I would build on what you're saying, and we've had a rich dialogue going on, you know, in the question space about the topics that you're talking about, and some of them had to do with this idea of context. So how do you shift a context that is in fact shaping what's possible to be brought forward? And there's that catch-22 of how do you work within a dynamic that and begin to shift a culture that is very much limited in what it can see as possible, or what it can see in terms of these concepts. So I wonder if you two could speak to that and what you're learning about that.
I can say what I think Diana should say.
Go ahead, Frank, and then maybe I'll speak to Frank.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I think that's the value. That's why introducing appreciative inquiry is a small move that has large consequences. Asking people to tell stories about themselves and highlight moments of peak experiences is revolutionary. And you know, she's giving people an opportunity to be heard, to know and be known, introducing even subtle things like that, even into a, you know, even if it's in a Monday morning meeting about how we're going to spend the next week. You know, what's the agenda this week? To just to unfreeze for a moment. I shouldn't use the word unfreeze, because that's the old discontinuous model of change. But to open up those kinds of possibilities.
Frank, I think one of the phrases that came maybe from you, maybe from David, but I really like the notion of the appreciative dislodgement of certainty.
Yeah.
You know, in terms of that unfreezing. Here's my answer to the question. If you want to create change in an organization, in a community, in a family, it's really simple. Change who talks to whom and about what.
Yeah.
You can't plan the outcome. But Frank's example of the Navy saying, let's get some young folks talking about this challenge of how to redesign a nuclear submarine. You know, changing who's in the conversation is what makes a difference. You can't predict where it'll go. It builds back into that emergent, and then being there and making sure people get to talk, which is what Appreciative is about.
Sorry, Jenny, I got to respond, because the nuclear submarine example is exactly what you were talking about. So I remember when these young guys showed up in San Diego for this, they thought they were just reporting to they were following orders, reporting to a conference. And when people started to say to them, we want your ideas, they couldn't believe anybody cared. It took about an hour before they even got to the point where they could speak up, because they just thought they were following orders, supposed to come here for 3 days, had their notebooks to take notes. First, when they said, you don't wear your uniforms and we're just going to ask you for your input, they couldn't believe people cared. And then it went wild once they got it. So that's exactly right.
I think that, Frank, that example that you're giving response to Francis's question about how do you engage when identity is at stake, how do you engage the experimental process, because people feel vulnerable and fearful. And I think the example you're saying, take your uniform off, you know, right. Give it time. There's a process here. And I think that example is really unpacking practices that you have to take.
It's under the headline that Diana said, who talks to who about what.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, that should be like the banner. That, you know, that's the subtle move that matters. If we're choiceful about that. wild things can happen.
Jenny, I interrupted you. You've got another question for us.
I do, and it's building on some of what you both are saying. There is actually there's a number of questions coming up, but one that I think is kind of fun is that there were so many questions about what's the language we're using to talk about this, and what's it evoking. So are we talking about, what are the, and does participatory, collaborative leadership, is it about distributed leadership, and what are some new metaphors and images that, which I think in a sort of playful jazz sort of way might be fun to throw out, and what kinds of images come to your mind?
My bias is always going to go towards jazz, and I say organizational jam sessions, and there is an emerging language out now in the literature, even at MIT, the most rationalistic scientific technological university on the planet. They're starting to study this thing called collective intelligence. Again, it's some things about that language I like, some I don't. I don't like the language of emotional intelligence because I think it goes back to an individual. But collective intelligence is a little better. And jam sessions, distributed leadership. I like leadership practices that Diana mentioned. I've used that as well. Facilitative leadership activity. I don't know, Diana, what do you think?
Well, I'm kind of with you. A colleague, Alan Briskin, has a book on collective wisdom. And so that notion of beginning to build language that assumes the collective and assumes the relational, so that we're not trying to create relations, we're not trying to create the collective, it's there. What we want is kind of coherence. We want to be able to see the signals, to be able to understand what's happening. And so I think it's inviting us to a whole different kind of seeing, reflecting, designing. Improvisation is one of them. Inquiry is another, which is very, very powerful. The notion of attending to what we ask, because a question is a relational phenomena.
And I think you're speaking to another discussion item that's been going on here, is how not to create a binary between command and control and relational, but to see relational processes in all contexts. That is already there. And then made about language or narrative communities, and that in these communities we language certain things and foreground and background other things.
Yeah, but command and control is also relational. Right? I mean, it's a kind of relationship, right? Command and control is also a system of inquiry. It's a particular kind of inquiry.
Exactly, yeah.
So we need adjectives in front of those words, and we need to be more direct about what we're saying. I mean, bureaucracies are inquiring all the time. I just got an email this morning from, universities are awful about this.
Yeah.
Collecting data in order to set up a rule basically to control faculty behavior. They're asking questions all the time. What kind of questions? That's the important thing.
Right.
And I think one question that's coming up is, can you speak about power and oppression? How does this bring forward equity and social progress? And I think you have 1 minute to answer that or respond to it.
Well,
this is yours, Diana.
Yeah, thank you, Frank. I mean, for me, part of why I love appreciative inquiry is because implicit in it is, don't talk about me without me. And that comes from our colleague Marge Stiller. But it's getting all the voices in the room whose future it is. I think if we could get the whole world in one conversation, we'd love to. But understanding that unless people are in conversation and dialogue with each other, there's no chance that they will co-create something that works for everybody. And so appreciative inquiry for me it's one of those slow processes that can ramp up. And instead of looking, as Frank talked earlier, about change as episodic, it's over time. It's over time in an organization. And it allows more and more people to slowly find their voice. Because we've also recognized that when you move in and you say, okay, now we want you to have freedom to talk, people are in shock, they don't believe, they don't trust. So it takes time. But it means we've got to come together and be willing to find, and I think leading relationally is going to be an important set of practices. Quite frankly, a new terminology like leading relationally, we get to create what it means. So let's infuse it with power equity, with voice, with the kinds of balanced structure and autonomy. Let's make something up together that will help us all educate the next group of leaders, because I do believe that there are leaders, and make a difference in the world. I think this is a really powerful moment.
No, I just said that it's a powerful topic in itself that we probably need to give it time. And I started to respond to one of our participants here who said, yet this exists in institutional racism, I think. And it's a question that we're not going to do justice in a minute, and maybe need to talk about it in its own space.
I thought that was a really powerful, ending statement, Diana, in terms of the possibilities for what we can do as we move forward and begin to redefine. We have the opportunity to redefine what it means to lead and what that all entails. And that is what's important about this webinar series, was to explore these kinds of ideas and put them out in the world and get people engaged around it and have conversation. And it's also what we are doing in the Toastmasters program, is we are in fact co-creating this field together with those who are going to be joining us in the program, doing their research with us. So we want to just take 1 minute to wrap up. You can see we have a slide up that just describes what the program is. 2 years, degree granted by Middlesex University. This is a practitioner-focused program. There's credit for work experience here, and it's an opportunity to take these new concepts and these theories and put them into practice in your own work and write about it and share it with others and help build this field that is emerging around relational leading in a small and an international and an online cohort. And I emphasize the importance of small and international. We want diverse. We're going to be creating diverse cohorts who will be exploring these issues together. And it's a way to invite you to explore leading in these complex and global conditions that we're in the 21st century. So with that, we just want to say that there are a couple of places that you can go for more information on the program fall, and you get to be part of a pioneering group if you join us. So there's places to register online. There's an email that you can reach me at to have to set up a call, talk about the program and how it might fit your goals and needs.
Thank you, Jeannie. Thanks for sharing about the program. And thank you, Frank. Thank you, Diana. It's been a wonderful, passionate, rich conversation, and people are loving it. And if people are interested in listening to some of our past webinars, you can go to this link, or you can go to towsinstitute.net and search for Relational Leading, and then under the program, you can follow us on Twitter. It's a good way to connect with us, and we are continuing to post links on Relational Leading, and you can follow Taos Institute and Jeannie and myself at Think Play, and we can further this conversation. Thank you all once again for joining us and for the wonderful questions.
Thanks, Frank.
Everybody. Thanks, Diana. Thanks, everybody. Bye, Sal.
Thank you
Bye,
both.
Bye.
Wonderful
Bye-bye.
conversation.